Okay, how's it going? Nice to see you. Welcome back to one of these videos where you learn about all kinds of things. For this one, it's going to be about government and the very basics of government. So if you want to grab some notes, go ahead and make sure that you're writing down some of the places where you have to fill in a blank. And let's get this show on the road. Whenever I'm talking about government and why government is so important, the story of the two Koreas is what pops into my mind. And this satellite image is a great one because, as you can see, the borders of North Korea, which are surrounded right here, very clearly show that essentially they have no lights. And a lot of the reasons why they have no lights is because their economy isn't that great. And the reason why their economy isn't that great is because they have a type of government that you're going to be learning about this unit, which is where one person essentially has all the power. It's known as a dictatorship, authoritarian type of government. And it typically doesn't do the best things for the citizens that live there. In contrast, if you look right here, you can see right below it South Korea, and over here you can see Japan, which is like the third, fourth wealthiest economy in the world. And both of these two countries have democracies that are able to let them experience a lot of great things, including having energy to produce lights, including, like we can see, Seoul, South Korea, and Tokyo, Japan right here. So that's really kind of the core of learning about governments. One of the reasons why we learn about governments is knowing that if there's certain ones that are better than other ones, and if you do government right, it can lead to really good things for your citizen, including economic wealth and prosperity and freedom. Or if you don't have the right kind of government, it can lead to lack of freedom, no economic opportunities, and just some real problems like that. So this class is civics, and civics is government. So what is government? Government starts off really with rules. Somebody's got to make a rule. Usually the first rule somebody makes, if you've ever seen the movie Lord of the Flies, I know I have that as one of our hook activities where you've got all these kids on a desert island together. Well, when they wash up on shore, they have no rules, but pretty quickly they make rules to try and bring some order to their situation. And that's kind of the fundamental core of a government. You got to have rules, and usually the first rule is don't kill people, don't rob people or steal from people, and that's kind of the basis of government. Then for a government to work, you also have to have boundaries. So where are these rules going to apply and where are they not going to apply? So if I'm standing here, the rules will apply to me, and if I'm standing over here, they won't. So you got to have some kind of a boundary of where they're gonna, the rules are gonna apply and where they're not gonna apply. Enforcement's the next one. Once you make a rule, who's going to make people follow the rules, and then ultimately, who's going to say if the rules are fair, which is our next slide right here. Who is going to decide if the rule is fair or not? So here in this picture, we probably know the rule based on the sign, no littering. Looks like this guy right here got pulled over. He broke the rule of littering, and it's the police officer that's going to enforce it. Now, if he doesn't agree with it, he's just like, hey man, that's not fair. You shouldn't be giving me a ticket. I was just throwing out my apple core. If he thinks that the ticket's unfair, the enforcement's unfair, then he could, in theory, in our form of government, go and apply to the judicial branch and maybe take it to a judge. So when you're talking about government, it's very important to talk about what government isn't, and that's what anarchy is. Anarchy is where there is no government, no rules, it's total freedom, just like the slide says. Now there's really two types of anarchy that you can have. You can have a peaceful type of anarchy that I've heard it described as white anarchy. And you can see this if you want to pause the video real quick and watch the video clip about this gentleman named the Bear. You might know him as the guy who filmed the Double Rainbow video, which is just simply amazing if you haven't seen it. But take a minute to pause it, check out his video. And the reason why I put this up there is because Bear is living in the middle of nowhere, really, and for all intents and purposes, he's living in a state of very peaceful anarchy, and he loves it. He's just out kind of in the middle of nowhere, and he has no rules. He has total freedom. He can do kind of whatever he wants, and you'll see in that video he seems to love it. But then there's also the not so nice type of anarchy, and the movie The Purge, I think, kind of gets at what this possibly could look like. In that movie, which I've never seen, but I've heard that there's some not so nice things that happen in that movie. But anyway, in that movie, The Purge, there is essentially anarchy, but it's more violent, or I guess you would call it like a dark type of anarchy, where people are stealing, robbing, killing. It's like kind of the dark side. So that's kind of what anarchy is. We'll learn in Block 2 that some of the Enlightenment thinkers called this basically anarchy as the state of nature, is another way of saying it. So that's pretty much kind of the basis of no government. So now let's get into some of the very first types of government. Before we do that, though, I'm going to take a little bit of time looking at this triangle. What this triangle is, for all intents and purposes, we start all the way over here at the bottom. I like to say this is where we would have anarchy, where there would be zero government. However, as soon as somebody makes the first rule, like usually the first rule is don't kill anybody and don't steal from people. So as soon as you make a rule, you just went from zero government to a tiny, I guess you could say, percent of government. And then the more rules you add on, the larger your triangle will get. Until if you get to the opposite side, this would be like a state where there is no freedom, where one person has all the power. So this would be like your totalitarian, your anarchy, your dictator type of a government. So throughout this, throughout these blocks, you're going to see kind of wherever we are in that period, you'll see kind of how much power one person has, or the government has, versus how little power the government has. And if you look right here, one of the things we're going to get into in the whole unit lesson objective is keep it limited, bruh. It's kind of a light, easy, fun way of saying kind of the whole point of this government unit is some of the best governments are ones that have found a way to keep the government pretty small and limited. And that's kind of what the United States has, is a limited government. We'll talk more about that later. So if you look at this first slide, notice here's our pyramid down here. The purple arrows all the way over here. So one of the very first types of governments that start to emerge with early humans are authoritarian types of governments. And there's lots of different names for it, but it's basically where one person has all the power and it's concentrated. So whether these are kings and queens in Europe, whether these are emperors in China or Mesoamerica, or pharaohs in ancient Egypt, or authoritarian rulers in Mesopotamia. All of them have this in common. They all have one person having all the power. It's typically the easiest type of government, and if you have a benevolent or a nice ruler, they might do good things for the people, and it could possibly translate to positive things for society. But usually that's not what happens. Usually their power gets abused. There's a saying that goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's kind of what happens with these types of governments. Usually they might be good for the person in charge who has all the power, but they're not good for typically the people living in that country. But it is the easiest form of government, and that's usually why what the first type of government is that people choose. So you'll have a state of nature, and then usually that ends up in like a scene like The Purge, where people are getting killed, getting robbed, getting stolen from, and then somebody comes around and they say, whoa, this is crazy, I'm going to take charge here, I'm in charge, I have all the power, I'm going to have all my friends help me, which becomes kind of like the police or the army, and then they set some rules and they take total control. It's the easiest type of government, but also, like I said earlier, it's not the best for the people living there. One of the very first concepts of government that comes along is this thing known as the rule of law. What the rule of law is that government starts to write down the rules so that everybody can see them, and that B, they're consistently enforced, and there's no confusion as to what the rules are. One of the very first governments to do this was a guy by the name of Hammurabi, who first wrote down the laws on this stone. This is actually like the actual stone that he wrote down all the rules for that. I think it was Babylonian society. So he wrote down the rules, and there was no confusion about the rules. And it's a very important concept in government that the rules are written somewhere and they're very clear, and that they're not like changed or moved along the way. These rules that Hammurabi had were pretty hardcore. They were known as draconian. They were kind of eye for an eye. The example I always think of is somebody steals something, and in Hammurabi's rules, that person would get their hand cut off. So, although the rules were pretty hardcore, the concept of writing down the rules was very important and went on to greatly benefit governments since they started. Now, something interesting happens in the ancient world. So we have these authoritarian governments, but then the ancient Greek came along and they had a new idea of doing government. Instead of one person having all the power, they moved the power or the arrow down, not to anarchy, but to what we really would have kind of as the very first limited type of government. In this type of government, instead of one person having all the power, they moved to the people having the power. And that's really what the word democracy means in Greek. It means essentially power to the people, if you broke down like kind of the roots of it. So in Athens, in Greek, they practiced this new type of democracy. It's known as direct democracy. And indirect democracy, which is also called pure democracy, every citizen could vote. So if you take a look at this picture down here, in ancient Greece, technically the people would come out, and all the people, well, technically be like all the guys, but they would all come out, and if there was an issue, they would all vote. And this worked really well for Athens. The people had the power. People were able to speak and say what they wanted to. People could listen. They would put up to a vote, and whoever the majority, or whatever the majority said, is what would win. Now, there's some issues with this type of government. One of the issues is you could start to have the people start to have what we would call kind of like mob rule, where they might not necessarily listen to the minority. So like whoever lost, so if half the people or 60% of the people said, we vote for this, but then 40% of the people didn't get their way, the more minority group didn't necessarily have any kind of like say or protections. So that's one of the problems. Another problem is the size. As a country starts to grow and you get multiple cities, it becomes more and more difficult to try and get people to all come together to vote on an issue. So that's pretty much what a direct democracy is. And we're going to see that this is like a big step in moving the type of governments forward. Which leads us to the Roman Empire. So under the Roman Empire, you now have a new type of democracy known as an indirect democracy, or this is also known as, just like it says here, a representative democracy. In a representative democracy, the arrow moves a little bit further away from the people because the power isn't quite as directed in the people. In this type of government, essentially what you would have happen is that as Rome and the Roman Republic started to grow and get bigger, direct democracy wouldn't work because trying to get all the, like if you look at how much territory Rome controlled, holy schmauzers, look at all this area. To try and get all these people to try and come together in Rome to vote on a regular basis would have been super expensive, would have cost so much money. Even trying to get all those people concentrated in one place would have been too much. So what the ancient Romans figured out pretty quickly is, instead of having every person go and vote on every issue, wouldn't it make more sense if, let's just say you started here in this area of Spain, and you had all the people in this part of the Roman Empire select one, watch my fingers, representative to go and represent the people in Rome, that would be a much more efficient way of doing government. That's exactly what the Roman Empire did. Each one of these places, whether it was Spain, Gaul, Macedonia, maybe even down here in Egypt, or even up here in what would be modern day England, each one of these places would elect a representative that would then travel to Rome to represent them. So maybe, and this is a recreation of what the Roman Senate could have looked like. So let's just take this guy, homeboy right here. Let's just say that he was the guy that was sent by the people of Spain. So when he shows up to the meeting to make rules, he would say, I represent the people of Spain, and this is what they want. And then the guy right next to him, maybe let's say he came from over here in England, and he's just like, I'm the representative from England, and my people want this. So each one of these guys would come from a different place in the Roman Empire, and they would all be able to represent their people and pass laws that represented their people as a whole. And that's pretty much what we've seen, one of the best types of government that there is. And that's the type of government we have in the United States, right? hopefully you're to the point where you realize that we live in a representative democracy, which is known as a republic. We vote for people who go and represent us. It's not Rome that they're going to represent us in. It's Washington, D.C., but it's the same premise, and we're going to talk about how the governments that do this type of government are typically the most successful in terms of the benefits that they'll get for their people. Ancient Rome, it does this type of government, this representative democracy, and this does incredible things. There's a lot of freedom that the people in Rome get. Trade starts to flourish. And you start to have these huge gains in education and school, incredible gains in architecture, in entertainment, in trade, even in, one of these, what's going on here? This is a picture of a recreation of what would have just been like a public restroom. But this was something new to the ancient world. They actually had essentially like plumbing and toilets, so you could actually like go to the bathroom and not have it be in an outhouse, and you could have plumbing that would take the bad stuff away, and you might even be able to take a quick bath. So this type of representative democracy brought really just amazing things to ancient Rome, and it became one of the most successful civilizations up until that point, because of the type of government that they had moved towards. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't last. Rome goes from being a limited government, we can see right here where our arrow's here, to it goes into a slow slide back into an authoritarian government. And this starts with probably some guys you've heard of. The one you've probably heard of before is Caesar. Caesar was a famous, Julius Caesar, the whole like, I know a lot of you guys when it's lunchtime and your high school tummies are getting so hungry, one of the places you go to is Caesar's Pizza, because you want to get a hot and ready $5 pizza. Well, that pizza place is named after Julius Caesar right here. Caesar was a famous general, and he controlled the Roman armies to the north. But then there were two other generals, Pompey and Crassus, and they also were Roman generals. And they essentially moved towards the end of the Roman Republic to basically take over power, and they did. So Caesar and these two other generals came to the Senate, took over power, and they created this thing called the triumvirate, which was them three having all the power. So you can see that Rome's power went from being here to sliding much further down in terms of headed towards an authoritarian government, where the people essentially started to lose the power they had. This type of government where you have rule by few is known as an oligarchy. And just like it says, it's ruled by few. So when there's a small group of people that have the power, this is known as an oligarchy. Alright, and then last but not least, we know this, or maybe you don't know this, but essentially Caesar makes a move to take power. He does, and he is crowned the first emperor of Rome in 47 BC, and the Roman Republic officially is gone. And now we can see the arrow essentially has moved towards what we're started with. It's now where one person has all the power. In this case, it was an emperor. And as we'll see in the next block, the Roman Empire eventually starts to have kind of a downward slide to where eventually it collapses and it enters a state of kind of like anarchy. So that's pretty much it. The one last thing I'll say for this is kind of what we've seen in this first slide is going to be happening again and again. There's kind of a cycle in history where you go from anarchy to one person having all the power, towards usually moving towards limited government, back to dictatorship, back to anarchy, so on and so forth, process repeat. A lot of the reasons why America is such an amazing country is because it or a lot of people are hoping that we're going to be able to break the cycle and keep the type of government that's a limited government, so that the people of our country can benefit and get the things that limited government brings, in addition to other countries that have a similar government throughout the world. Alright, that's it for block 1. We'll see you at block 2. Bye.